Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Morning.
I hope you got a little sleep. One of the terms of art, if you like, in libertarian writing is something called the welfare warfare state. And this is a way of talking about the kind of states that have developed all over the world in the past century, or a little more than that if we go back to the most distinct beginnings. And I don't know if Murray Rothbard invented this term or whether he merely popularized it, but it's a term that libertarians use frequently in an attempt to signify in a compact way that the modern state is not simply like states in any previous time, which is based on conquest and violence and repression of their opponents and enemies. If you've never looked into theories about the origin of the state, I can tell you briefly that there's very little doubt that states arose roughly 10,000 years ago as a result of conquest of one group by another. The conquerors were usually people who had learned how to use horses, and they had superior war-making skills to those who made their living by settled agriculture. And so these mounted warriors found it easier to get what they wanted in life by stealing than by producing, working, and creating. And eventually it occurred to some of them that it was even a better deal for them if, rather than just going here and there, stealing, plundering, and then going somewhere else to plunder, they would settle down in a particular place where the previous inhabitants were productive, and they would become what Mansur Olson calls stationary bandits rather than roving bandits. And so the metaphor of the stationary bandit is also one you'll hear if you read much about the state written in the past 50 years or so. And I think it's a nice, apt metaphor, because in fact that's overwhelmingly what states do. They take things, wealth from people. Nowadays they take it in money form, and they make rules for the people they are plundering, and eventually they make all kinds of rules, and ultimately they realize that it's to their advantage not merely to plunder people sort of up to the point that people will tolerate, but they can do even better if, in a sense, they help the people they're plundering to become more productive. One way is by protecting them from roving bandits, other threats to their life and limb, and another way is by producing orderly conditions, imposing rules that keep them from killing one another, more or less, and perhaps building certain kind of infrastructure that will increase their productivity. And so, as it were, the captive hens are laying more eggs to be snatched by the poultry farmer, stationary bandit. I raise chickens, so that metaphor comes to my mind very easily. I always assure my hens that it's only rent I'm collecting. It's not really plunder. They don't always agree, but at all events, the idea of the state as doing a certain amount to protect and enhance the productivity of people has been around for a long time, but until fairly recently in history, this kind of protective aspect of the state was quite limited. And when it came to ordinary kinds of what we now think of as welfare, social services, people were pretty much on their own. And as a result, they developed a variety of institutions to take care of those who were in distress or unable to care for themselves, or orphans and widows and people who were sick or disabled or somehow otherwise incapable of supporting themselves. The family has always been the main institution for these purposes, always, and still is today. If you've ever been yourself in distress or been a member of a family where someone was, you can appreciate that's where the real help comes from. When it requires people to be there 24 hours a day or to make real sacrifices. The communists in some societies tried to stamp out the family because they were very averse to this competing institution. They didn't want anything to compete with the state. And Engels wrote very zealously about the horrors of the family and private property and marriage and all these long established institutions that people had used as long as there had been any kind of recognizable human societies at all to take care of the people who needed special care.
What was he saying about family exactly?
What did Engels object to?
Yeah.
Well, he simply thought that the family was a kind of trick. It was a way of exploiting women. It was a way of sort of sanctifying the state at arm's length, the bourgeois state, which, he looked forward to the death of the bourgeois state when true communism was reached in that stage of development. So he just thought the quicker that people gave up these institutions, the closer we would be to the ultimate utopian goal of pure communism. But wherever the communists tried to stamp out the state or restrict it or punish it or do something like that to hurt it, they failed. In the Eastern European countries, where lots of efforts were made along those lines, the family was the thing that really kept people going. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from people who lived under communism in Eastern Europe about the strength, durability of the family, which the communists tried to subvert and corrupt. They tried to make family members turn against one another, spy on one another, and otherwise harm one another. But the family was resilient. In addition to the family, people developed many other ways to take care of the unfortunates. Eventually, they had an enormous variety of private institutions. Early labor unions did a lot of welfare work. Societies were founded, mutual benefit societies in Europe and thousands in the United States by lodges and by other private groups, often ethnically based, so that if you go to an old industrial city like Allentown, Pennsylvania, for example, you'll see that because probably 80 or 90 distinct ethnic groups moved there in the late 19th, early 20th century to work in the steel industry. They brought with them institutions, or they built institutions to care for one another. When men were hurt on the job or unemployed or sick, and these institutions were supported by them to provide benefits to the ones who needed it. Because society in general was poor, because the productivity of labor in general was low, they couldn't provide lavish benefits, but given the context, their benefits were very important. They made the difference between survival and failing to survive. So there was never a time when people lacked welfare, as it were. They always found ways to provide care that was especially needed. This vision of people dying in the gutters is an invention. It was never the case. Local governments were the only governmental units involved in the United States in providing welfare until the latter part of the 19th century, and they didn't do much. Counties would often maintain a place, which used to be called, even when I was a boy, they were called the county poorhouse. And that was a kind of indoor housing or residence for people who were completely unable to support themselves and had no one to help them. So counties would do that, and big cities would provide assistance, especially during depressions. They would set up soup kitchens and places where people could at least get a meal when they were without income. And that was about it for government provision of assistance. But things began to change after the war between the states, and that war was crucial. And this takes us back to the welfare-warfare state, because sometimes people view these two aspects of government as distinct and competitive, which in a way they are. If you spend $1 for war, it's not available to be spent on welfare programs. But historically, many of the welfare programs that were developed on a permanent basis have their origins in wartime programs of some kind. And in this country, right after the war between the states, the veterans, who were numerous, there were millions of them, the Union Army, as of 1865, was the biggest army the world had ever seen, and probably the best equipped as well at that point. Not the best army, but the biggest and best equipped. So there were lots of these veterans who had served in the war, and they formed this group called the Grand Army of the Republic, which was not an army, it was a lobby. And these guys were a very strong lobby, because if you look at the politicians who were in high office after that war, practically every one of them had been an officer in the Army during the war. If you look at all the U.S. presidents, for example, after the war ended, after President Johnson left office, except for Grover Cleveland, they're all former military officers right to the end of the century. And so every time there was an election, the Republicans went out. And they were the war party. They were the party that won the war and put their people in positions of rule throughout the South and the rest of the country. And so they went out and did what historians call waving the bloody shirt. They would say, you know, you owe it to us. We saved the Union. So what they were seeking was mainly pensions. And if they had pensions, they sought bigger ones. And if they weren't qualified for a pension, they sought a change in the laws that would qualify them. And eventually, so many people were qualified for pensions that it reached ridiculous lengths. Even men who had deserted from their units during the war showed that they had been in a unit at some time and qualified for a pension. That's gratitude. Booty for the turncoats. And then people's relatives were brought into the deal. And veterans, first their widows, and then their more distant relatives, and sometimes their make-believe relatives. And even as lax as these laws were for providing veterans benefits, they weren't lax enough, and so congressmen would routinely introduce what were called private bills. And this was just a legislative act introduced by an individual congressman to provide benefits for a specific person in recognition of that person's alleged service to the nation in the war. And these private bills became a main form of patronage. You elect your Republican congressman, and then he in turn provides Joe Schmo with a pension, even though Joe may have never got out of Indianapolis, and even there he had probably only served for a few months, if at all. So this was just a form of politically connected looting tied to the war as its overarching justification. But it provided a big model, and in fact it was a major part of federal government spending in the late 19th century. These pensions added up, even as late as the end of the century, to the biggest single item in the federal budget. So it was not a small deal, and it established the idea that the federal government could, and in certain circumstances ought to, provide welfare benefits for people, pensions. Now, roughly at the same time, or slightly later, and starting in the 1880s in Germany, Germany was rapidly developing industrially, and as I mentioned yesterday, it was also developing a big socialist movement, the biggest in the world. And this was a real socialist movement. What they sought was the nationalization of the means of production, all of them, and their management by the state for public benefit. Not the total elimination of private property, but something that went very far in that direction. So in Germany, these socialists were a real menace to the conservative rulers, who were also members of the warrior class, mostly from Prussia, which had been the leading element in the German unification of 1870s and onward, which combined a great number, I can't remember how many, it could have been 100 or more, small German states that still existed at that time, and it brought them all together as one single nation with a national government. And the chancellor of this unified Germany was one of these military officers, Otto von Bismarck. And he was a kind of political genius. I don't know how astute he was as a general, but he had a flair for politics. What he realized was that these socialists could spoil everything. And so they were too numerous to crush. So, those you can't intimidate, you can co-opt. That's one of the rules of politics. Every man has his price, and most people's price is pitifully low. Okay? Politicians have proven that over and over and over. You can buy a man's soul for pocket change, okay? If he thinks he's getting something for nothing, especially. So Bismarck said, look, these people have complaints. They say, they've got trouble in the system, the private property capitalist system that's operating out here because of unemployment, because of injuries on the job that disable them, because they get too old to work, all these things that had been around for a long time but seemed more severe in an industrial economy, and in some ways were more severe in that economy. So Bismarck said, let's establish welfare benefits of this kind. We'll provide pensions for old people and unemployment insurance and sick, like health insurance, Obamacare, which was then called Bismarck Care, that kind of stuff. And so the Germans devised a whole menu of these kinds of welfare programs. Now, in those days, Germany was not just a burgeoning economic and industrial power, but it was also widely regarded as the most advanced and civilized country in the world. Germany used to be the nation of poets, before the days of the Nazis. That took a little of the shine off the poetry. But, and that's unfair to all the poets because they had no responsibility for what the Nazis did. But at all events, Germany was where you went if you, say, wanted an advanced education. And so as Americans began to take an interest in such a thing as advanced education in the late 19th century, a lot of Americans, particularly in the social sciences and history, went, at least for a while, to study in Germany. And many of them actually got their PhD degrees there. You couldn't get a PhD degree in the United States before 1876. No institution granted such a degree. And the school where I got my own PhD, Johns Hopkins, was the first one that did that. And it was modeled on German universities. It was and remains to this day primarily a research institution, lots of graduate students, relatively few undergraduates. And after Hopkins, a number of other schools, such as Harvard and Columbia and Princeton, they all moved in the same direction. And so this German model was terribly important. But when these guys went to Germany, they were exposed not only to what the professor had to say, but also exposed to how Germans were doing things, such as setting up a welfare state. And they thought, wow, this is hunky-dory. The most advanced people in the world are doing it this way, so we'd be backward if we didn't do the same kind of thing. You still hear this today. This is a favorite form of argument of, like people surround Hillary Clinton. They adore German welfare state, and they'd like to, make the United States more like it. So the German model was very influential and began to affect the thinking of advanced thinkers, opinion leaders in the late 19th century. And often it took a while before they were able to have enough political influence for their ideas to be implemented, but nonetheless it was important that those ideas were being espoused at high levels. These weren't kooks, like these were the best intellectuals America had to offer. And certain people were especially important. There was a man named Ely. His name was E-L-Y. And Ely was a Hopkins professor and taught also at other places in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of his students was a man named John Commons, who went to Wisconsin and became the most important economics professor there and sort of father of what's sometimes called the Commons School, or the Institutional Economics School, as it was known. And one of Commons' students was a man named Witte, W-I-T-T-E. And Witte was the prime author and leader of the group that wrote the Social Security Act, which was enacted in 1935. So there's a clear line here. Ely worships German welfare state, teaches Commons, Commons teaches Witte, Witte fathers the Social Security Act. So this German model you can trace in countless ways. There's some wonderful writing on this by Murray Rothbard in a book called The Costs of War. He has an essay of about 100 pages, as I recall, which tracks a number of these kinds of changes and shows who was involved in doing what. Okay? Now, in the late 19th and especially the early 20th century, a number of states began to provide forms of welfare aimed at women and children. These were things that in some cases were just frauds, because what they did in the guise of protecting women was to say, put limits on hours of work for women, thereby making women less competitive with men in the marketplace and actually hurting women's interests rather than helping them. Lots of states enacted requirements for children to attend school. That had not been the rule for most states before the late 19th century. It was up to parents whether the children went to school or not. But by the early 20th century, even the southern states, those backward southerners, we're such hicks, they had adopted compulsory schooling. And so everybody, in the guise of protecting children from being exploited by getting sent to work, or by just not being educated, had put the law, the state, behind the requirement that children be in school for some considerable period of time, usually through at least 8 grades of schooling. And then, in addition to the German influence that I've mentioned, a group of people that were related to the churches or to church institutions such as settlement houses set up to help the destitute in big cities. They began to be influential because they weren't just people who took it upon themselves to provide aid to those who needed it. They also politicked to get the state involved. And that's a very common way that these things unfold. And increasingly, the state was happy to become involved because, as I mentioned yesterday, every time you increase the power of the state, you give more resources to every politician to sell in exchange for how he votes. He's got more to provide on his end in order to buy votes for himself. Okay? This social gospel movement, as it was called, was in many ways a kind of betrayal of traditional church doctrine, because Jesus didn't say, get a law passed. He said, help poor people. You help them. Don't put a gun to somebody's head and force them to help. But anyhow, that's what it ended up being. And the social gospel crowd were very influential components in the progressive movement overall. And part of progressivism, which is a very complex collection of ideas and institutions in the first couple of decades of the 20th century especially, but progressivism stuck. Okay? We're still progressive today. That was the landmark event in kind of social thinking in this country, was the transition from classical liberalism or limited state ideas of some kind to progressivism. And now everybody's progressives, or something very close to progressives, although the Republicans, of course, don't call themselves progressive and are appalled if you tell them they are, but they are. Okay? So this was a big ideological shift attended by a variety of new institutions and increasingly state-based institutions. The federal government still hadn't got very involved in this kind of activity, in part because it really was hard to read the Constitution and find any basis there for the federal government's doing these kinds of things. The fact that the preamble mentions promote the general welfare, first of all, didn't establish any power. Okay? That's just an introduction to the document. Okay? It's a rhetorical flourish. Okay? And even then, provide for the social the welfare didn't signify what we mean today by welfare. It didn't mean handouts to people, okay? Transfer payments. It just meant to provide for the well-being of everybody in the country. But this all changed during the 1930s when, particularly when Roosevelt took office in 1933. And the New Deal was a very heterogeneous collection of programs based on a whole variety of different ideas, but a major part of it was this kind of welfare ideal brought over from progressivism. Most of the prominent New Dealers themselves were progressives and had actually, in many cases, had positions of some importance during World War I in the Wilson administration. And so they're still fighting for their same battles. But now their opportunities are much greater. Opportunists, whether economic or political, see their chance as best in a crisis. And so they come out of the woodwork. They've got easy people to convince then, because so many people are suffering. It's very easy to make the case that existing institutions have failed when you look around yourself in 1932 or 3 or 4. About 25% of the labor force was unemployed, and another 25% was partly employed when it wanted to be fully employed.
How strong was the counter-argument to this sort of progressive welfare state build-up at this time?
Well, it was strong because it inherited everything that Americans had generally believed as mainly Jeffersonian adherents for a century or more. So it wasn't a weak resistance, but it, of course, was much less compelling in the circumstances of the Great Depression, because people want something that works. You know, they don't just want a beautiful idea or something that seems consistent with justice. They want help when there doesn't seem to be any other place to turn for it. And a lot of these private institutions that had traditionally served to sustain the unfortunates were just overwhelmed by the unemployment and destitution of the early 1930s. So many people were losing their homes to foreclosed mortgages, or losing their homes just because they had to sell them. They couldn't afford to live and pay the mortgage anymore. And people's incomes are greatly reduced. And so just tremendous numbers of people needed help, and local charitable institutions just didn't have the means to meet that need. A lot of people lost faith too. The change in the masses' ideology in the 1930s was really quite astounding, and this has been studied quite a bit by people who study public opinion trends. So the New Deal comes in. The first thing, one of the first things, not the very first, but among the first things the Roosevelt administration did was provide programs to relieve unemployment. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, on my listing here, was a combined state-federal program to channel money into assisting the unemployed. And the Public Works Administration was a federal program for construction projects and other building. They even built battleships besides building hospitals. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, was the biggest of these programs. It was a combined state-federal program, again, to hire people who supposedly would not have been able to get a job otherwise. Increasingly, however, it turned out that many of the people being hired for WPA projects probably could have got another kind of job, but for one reason or another found the WPA work a superior alternative. And so, in fact, the WPA was one of the reasons why the labor market performed so terribly in the 1930s. Whenever you interfere in the price system, what do you know? It doesn't work as well anymore. And the New Deal was a massive, multifaceted interference in the price system in more ways than I could recite if I just stood here listing them for the whole day. So the National Youth Administration was aimed especially at young people who were subject to extraordinarily high rates of unemployment. I mentioned the Civilian Conservation Corps yesterday had hired young men. The National Youth Administration hired a lot of college students, young people who were just unable to ever find a job. Many young people never got a real job throughout the whole decade of the 1930s because so many unemployed people with experience were in the line. So an employer wants to hire somebody. Who's he going to hire first? The guy with experience or the guy with none? So lots of young people just had to scratch and get by in one way or another, and some of these government programs were a way of getting by for them. The Social Security Act, which I mentioned, is one of the biggest, most important government actions in American history, provided for old age pensions, provided for various forms of welfare, assistance to the blind, assistance to the elderly, disabled, and various categories of assistance in addition to old age pensions. And then later on it was expanded and I'll come to that in a minute. The Fair Labor Standards Act was the minimum wage law at the federal level. There had been minimum wages earlier in 1933 and 34 under the initial National Industrial Recovery Act, which required minimum wages of a certain amount, but they weren't nationally uniform. They varied by industry and by geography. But in 1938, we get the National Minimum Wage Law. It exempted some people, such as agricultural workers, but over time, more and more people were brought under the Act's requirements, so that eventually it applied to almost everybody. And of course now it's controversial again because there are proposals, serious proposals right now in Congress to increase the minimum wage very substantially. And local experiments. Local areas are permitted to set their own minimum wages as long as they're above the national minimum. So you've probably read about this Seattle city action to raise the minimum wage over a 7-year period to $15 an hour. And one little neighborhood south of Seattle has already raised its minimum wage, I think, to 15. But that just meant that everybody who was hiring minimum wage workers moved just outside the boundary of that place. It doesn't have too bad an effect. But when Seattle raises its minimum wage, if it ever does, to $15 an hour, it's going to have a major disastrous effect on low-earning workers there. So there's a lot more I could say about the New Deal, but this is really the granddaddy of the American welfare state, and the Social Security Act in particular is the biggest deal of all. During the war, as I mentioned, we had over altogether 16 million people serving in the armed forces at some time. If you think of those people as a voting bloc, and that is how Roosevelt thought about them, I can assure you. Actually, Roosevelt thought of every group you can identify as a voting bloc. That was his game, politics. He wasn't coy about it. He used to explain to people, you take care of this, that, and the other, I'll take care of the politics. And after all, he was elected president 4 times, so who's going to argue with him? But during the war, you had all these people in service, and the question is, are they going to become another Grand Army of the Republic? Who's going to control this mass of votes, if anybody? How are they going to buy it? And so the politicians scurried to get on record as having done wonderful things for the veterans. And they enacted this bill known popularly as the GI Bill of Rights, which was a variety of benefits, payments to go to college, payments to start a business, payments just to be unemployed for up to a year, hospital facilities, and you know how great those have proved to be, and the Veterans Administration hospitals. That's been in the news lately too. Just a host of other benefits were provided in an attempt to buy the votes of these servicemen, and it was enacted in time for them to vote appropriately in the 1944 election, in which Roosevelt was reelected for the 3rd time. So that was a major landmark too, because it put the federal government, for example, in the business of supporting people to go to college. It hadn't done that before, except for the military academies, which it ran. But to just go to Iowa State, the federal government was not involved in that. But after World War II, it was, and millions of these veterans of the war ultimately did take advantage of that and of other benefits of the GI Bill. So it's a kind of welfare state inside the welfare state. It has so many facets and spends so much money. It has its own cabinet position in the government. So it's a very important part of the welfare state in this country. In 1956, the Social Security Act was amended to provide support for disabled people. And in the beginning, that wasn't a big part of Social Security, but it got bigger and bigger over time. And the standards became laxer and laxer to qualify. And in fact, just in the past 6 years, the standards have been made so lax that disability benefits have acted as a de facto unemployment insurance. So for a lot of people who are out of work and either don't want to go back to work or can't find a job, they instead of applying for unemployment benefits, which do expire unless temporarily extended, as they have been several times in recent years, but they will expire, but disability benefits may last forever. And so it's actually become a kind of scam. It's not that nobody's ever really disabled. Some people are hurt and can't work. Okay? And that reality keeps this scam afloat, because a very large number of the people who receive disability payments can work, and in many cases are working in the underground economy and doing all kinds of things. But disability funding has literally got out of control, and the system is practically broke in terms of the way it's financed. And so increasingly it and all these other government welfare programs are going to just be financed out of general revenues rather than their designated revenue sources. And they're just going to eat up the entire budget. I'll show you something about that in a moment. Things quieted down for a while in the 50s, early 60s, but then a second round of the welfare state geared up under the so-called Great Society of Johnson and extended into Nixon's term in office as well. So this whole period when those two guys were president is a period of explosion of welfare programs of one kind or another. The Civil Rights Act was a major part of this, not because it was a benefit program, but because it was a kind of justification for a lot of programs that were benefit programs. The idea here was that blacks have been discriminated against, they've been segregated by law, they've been treated horribly, not only under slavery, but for a century after the end of slavery. And so they occupy a very inferior position in economic life, and they are owed a kind of special assistance. They're disproportionately found among the ranks of the poor. So if you want to help blacks, helping the poor is an indirect way to do that, or vice versa. Okay? So the whole ideological impetus of the 1960s was a collection of ideas about ending discrimination, helping blacks and similarly disadvantaged groups, and providing federal benefits. The Food Stamp Act, 1964, was another one of these ideas that started slowly, but eventually got very big in terms of the amount of money being consumed. And most important of all, we can now see, was that in 1965, the Social Security Act was amended again, and it was amended by inclusion of Medicare and Medicaid. Now, when these changes were being debated in Congress, of course, they had studies of the projected fiscal impact the programs would have. And if you go back and look at their projections of how much Medicare and Medicaid would cost, they're ludicrous. They're off by an order of magnitude. Okay? It's not that they underestimated the cost by 10%. They underestimated it by tenfold if you go out 20 or 30 years. So these have become gigantic, and Medicare in particular now, with the baby boom, big cohort of people rapidly going into retirement, and being old enough to qualify for Medicare because it's not means tested. You don't have to have a low income. Bill Gates can get Medicare if he chooses to. I trust he's not choosing. But anybody over 65 can get Medicare benefits. And so practically everybody does get them. And medical costs rise exponentially as people age. So we're getting more and more of these old people as a share of the population, which means we're going to get more and more costly medical care, bills being provided for Medicare to pay for.
Do you think that a lot of medical costs are very inflated, like they're way above how they should be?
Well, they're way above where they would be if we had a free market in health services. Very far above that. But like everything that the state does, it becomes politicized, and so people who are interested in this, not because they care about the sick and dying, but because they care about the income of doctors and nurses and other medical service providers, they're the ones that provide the real backing for the program. So every time there's something that's supposedly aimed at helping the poor, the unfortunate, and so forth, you know it's a scam, okay? Because ask yourself, how much political influence do the poor, the unfortunate, and the people dying in the street have? Zippo. They don't have any. So the only way you get laws like that is if people who have political influence support such laws. And by and large, they support such laws for their own narrow interests. Doctors weren't crazy about Medicare in the beginning, but they quickly discovered that, aha, this was not a bad deal for them at all. And then they became strong supporters. So this was the biggest part of the welfare state's growth during the Great Society. There were lots of other things, and I'm not going to stop to talk about them. This chart shows us welfare benefits for all kinds of government social welfare to individuals relative to the amount of wages and salaries paid in the whole U.S. economy. As you can see, if we go back here to the late 1950s, it's about 9% relatively. So as I keep reminding you, people were not dying in the street in 1959. See, I was there, I would have noticed. So it wasn't happening, okay? But still, social welfare benefits of all governments relative to wages and salaries, you know, we're about 1/11. 1/11. Now, they kind of trickle along there until we get into the 1970s, when the effect of Social Security benefit increases in Social Security eligibility, Medicare, Medicaid, they start to become factors. And that's when we take a big leap up. By the time we get up here, even into the mid-1970s, we've gone from 9% to about 23% in the worst part of the recession that extended into about 1975. Then it levels off for a while here, and then starting in the 1990s, there's a bulge, a retrenchment under Clinton, then increase again in the early 21st century, and then when the current recession starts in 2008, a huge jump up. We finally get up here to a level of about 36%. So we've gone up from 9% to 36% relative to wages and salaries. We're talking about major sources of income in this country come from transfer payments. Payments the government makes to people in exchange for nothing. Okay? It's different from a government purchase. If government pays Lockheed Martin $1 bajillion for a fighter plane, at least it gets a fighter plane. Okay? The government makes these transfer payments, it doesn't get anything in return at all. It's just a transfer from people who have income to people who are going to get it via the government. This chart is for only federal welfare spending and only means tested. So this doesn't include, say, Social Security, which is not means tested, or Medicare, which is not means tested. But a lot of these poverty programs require you to be poor. You have to have an income below a certain level. In some cases, you have to have wealth below a certain level, for Medicaid, for example. So what we're seeing here is only a part of the modern welfare state, only a federal part, and these amounts of money shown here are corrected for changes in the overall price level, so that we've kind of crudely at least taken out the effect of inflation. And what we see is the real level going from back in 1950 is practically nothing. Such programs basically were negligible and don't become important until the Great Society starts the so-called war on poverty. Then they increase very rapidly through the 1970s. And the Reagan administration didn't slash them, as people complained. It kept them from growing rapidly for a while, but only for a short while. And then they start up again in the late 80s. Again, they're checked for a while under Clinton. It's kind of odd here. I keep saying, these things I'm showing you growing in the welfare warfare state all look as if they're checked by Clinton. People think Clinton, is this horrible guy. But fiscally speaking, Clinton was like the best of a bad bunch for the whole periods since Eisenhower. So this may have been an accident, by the way. It wasn't entirely what he wanted, but as a result of Clinton and the Congress of the day, his day, we did have a lot of government programs that were at least held where they had grown for a few years, but then we're off to the races again up here, and in the current recession, we zoom up to a much higher level. So we've got this effect I call a ratchet effect, where the government grows in some dimension rapidly as a result of some perceived crisis or near crisis or emergency, and then it sometimes falls back. In this case, it at least stops, holds for a while, then another new crisis or opportunity comes along, it's jacked up again. This effect can be seen in many dimensions of the growth of government, especially those related to war, but they also can be seen in non-war related aspects of government as well.
It's so weird that you can declare war on poverty, like it's some sort of thing that
We've been at that word for like 60 years now.
Yeah, the war is an appealing metaphor, right, to politicians, because war, they think, and to some extent they think correctly, is an occasion when people become unified in their desires for government action. Okay? Usually in actual wartime, people are unified in wanting defense against foreign enemies. Okay? And there's no doubt of that, although many of the wars the United States fights are not really against people who pose serious threats to anybody's safety, negligible threats. Your threats of falling down and dying in the bathtub are greater than your threats of being killed by the Iranians. Okay? So that doesn't matter. The politics of war are such that it's an appealing metaphor, and so it's carried over. It's used for everything. And just a second, I'll come to you. And William James was an important American philosopher. And he wrote an essay in the beginning of the 20th century called The Moral Equivalent of War. And he wanted one, see? James said, look, it's great that during wartime we all become unified in support of some important, critical national objective. We get together and we all support this thing. winning a war. But the trouble, he says, unfortunately, wars are destructive and they kill a lot of people. So what we really need is we need something like war in its ability to energize and unify the people, but not destructive like war. So we need the moral equivalent of war. And he said, we want one of those. And well, the politicians were all ears. Politicians don't spend a lot of time reading philosophy, but they are willing to pick a metaphor here and there if it serves their purposes. So from that time on, there's been war on this and war on that, particularly since World War II, because World War II was the best war ever for unifying and energizing the people. So that made the Americans big believers in what the government could do if it had some great enterprise to pursue. They'd say, if we could defeat the Nazi war machine and the Japanese imperialists, what can't we do? Surely everything else is simple compared to those great tasks. And that was really a stupid argument, because actually winning a war is incredibly simple compared to doing something like eliminating poverty. They're not analogous in any way, wholly different in their degree of difficulty.
War on
Yes,
fight, war on charity, war on war.
Yeah, I'm for war on war. Yeah, I'll buy that. Yes, ma'am.
Now this might be a personal question, and it might be completely off topic, but when you said before yesterday that you did protest against the Vietnam War, did you do it because of the war or because of the soldiers or because of the government? Like, what influenced you to protest?
Well,
Or was it the whole
I disliked everything about it, but what I disliked most was that the United States government had gone to Vietnam and was killing thousands of people every day for no reason. Okay? And I don't like mass murder. That's what I was against most of all. I just never developed my taste for mass murder. And in that respect, I'm different from most Americans. They love it if it's, they dishing it out rather than taking it. So, are we running out of time?
Yes.
I was expecting. Oh, did you? I missed it. Okay. Well, let me see if I've got just one more thing to show you. It's just more illustration of the growth of the welfare state, and so I'm pretty close to where I wanted to be at the end. Thank you very much.